All right, so we are starting our lecture on vulnerabilities. Cool. So again, just like the subtitle says, it's all about knowing yourself, knowing your weaknesses. And really, we're kind of going to categorize vulnerabilities. We're going to list a whole bunch of them. All of them should really look familiar to you. Some of them will be new, but that's okay. So let's get started. What are we talking about today? We're going to list out vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about what vulnerability scanning is and what that looks like. Then we talk about how we manage vulnerabilities. Just like we manage assets and categorize them, we're going to also manage our vulnerabilities because you can't get rid of every vulnerability. Some of them you just have to manage. Okay, so why do we have vulnerability assessments? Well, the same reason that we identify our assets so we can protect them, we have to identify our vulnerabilities so that we can mitigate them, right? Not super crazy big brain idea here, but if we don't know about these things, we can't act on them. And so in order to find out about our vulnerabilities, we have a whole bunch of automated tools to find these vulnerabilities. And then, once we've used these automated tools, that's where you come in as the actual person with a brain. You have to look at what the output of these tools and determine what is the appropriate action to take. I'm pretty sure that's literally one of the CompTIA CISA domains. It literally says that, taking in output from vulnerability assessments or vulnerability scanners and doing the appropriate action. So what are vulnerability assessments? We're going to use software, right? Obviously, you're not going to manually look at it to learn about a system, and it's going to report back. Well, what are the things that it's going to report back to us? It's going to tell us about the attributes of that software, right? It's going to give us some kind of baseline to establish what does normal look like. We're going to look for what is not normal, right? If this is what normal is, we've already established a baseline. What are the abnormalities? Because that's usually worth looking at. And then finally, reporting these results to you. So this is what the software is going to do for us. Again, this is usually done with some kind of automation. Right? Tools where you've already used some of them, right? Nikto, it's a vulnerability scanner for web servers, right? What did it do? Collected the attributes, determined what the baseline is, looks for anything anomalous, and gave you those results. And what was your job then as the red teamer that's trying to break in? You looked for exploits for those vulnerabilities. Right? We're flipping the chessboard around, and now we're just going to patch these vulnerabilities or remediate them or mitigate them somehow. Okay, so this is where we get creative and I ask you guys questions. So tell me, give me some examples of vulnerabilities specific to servers and applications. What is a vulnerability on a particular server or application?
It's out of date.
Yep, that's for sure. Out of date. So we
using default passwords.
Using default protect. Yeah, I'd say that's definitely a vulnerability. What else? There's a ton. There's a ton, and I know you've used them all, so just let them out.
Cross-site scripting on like a web server.
Mm-hmm. These are all on my list. That's why I'm not pressing anything yet. I want to see how many of them.
Validation and all that, or input cleaning.
I wouldn't describe that as a vulnerability. I would describe input validation as, or input sanitization as a mitigation or a mediation for a vulnerability. But I wouldn't call
lacking it.
Lacking it. Okay. No input sanitization. I got it. That's not on my list, so I like it.
Too much network traffic?
Tell me more.
So basically the web server is not able to handle the amount, like let's say an item dropped or something and everybody went to that website. Would that be an incompetency?
Vulnerability, not potentially. I wouldn't think of it so much as vulnerable. Potentially. I could see it argued either way. What else? Come on, what was a hard one that you guys did at the end of Red Team? We spent 2 days on it.
Buffer overflows.
What else? What did you do once you got a shell on a box generally? What do you try and do after that?
Privilege escalation.
Mm-hmm. We didn't get to do this, but if they were not using HTTPS, they're using an insecure protocol, I'd say that's a vulnerability. All right, you got pretty much all the ones I got on my list. Let's see. Missing patches, outdated systems, buffer overflows, privilege esque, arbitrary code execution, insecure protocols, debug, all of those general web ones, etc. Right? All of these things are the vulnerabilities that you can expect to find on specifically servers and applications. Okay.
Why is privilege escalation a vulnerability?
You should not be able to escalate your privileges. That'd be a vulnerability if you're able to escalate your privileges, and you shouldn't be able to because you'd be breaking the authorization part of AAA. So I would describe privilege escalation as a vulnerability. I see what you're saying. You could argue that it's not, because sometimes you are supposed to elevate privileges, right? Like sometimes certain users should be able to sudo things. So if we want to make, you know what, if you want to make this, if you want to press on me, we'll say, I'll update this slide and we'll say, you know, maybe misconfigured pseudo permissions or something like that. I'll do something to make it better because you got me there on that one. I'll say, right. This is the same idea of, is a door a vulnerability? Well, it is a hole that gets things in, but I mean, it's supposed to be there to let you in. So it could be, I guess. It depends on the context. So I'll update this slide. I like it. I like being challenged on that. Let's talk about vulnerabilities for networks. This one's a little more challenging. I know that there's at least a couple that I bet you can, off my list, that you can do. It was a big vulnerability that we had in the PWK network, so we could see where everything was, see who everything was.
Unauthorized zone transfers.
Yeah, zone transfers. I'm trying to think. What is? I guess this one touches on the other ones. So I'll just give them. We have firmware updates. So, you know, again, we don't say this so much with PWK, but if we have routers and other sorts of devices that are not updated, I should update this slide so it says unupdated or non-patched firmware and stuff like that. Outdated ciphers, right? So if you're not using the most up-to-date SSL or TLS layer, right, people might be able to read, and you'd be breaching the confidentiality there, right? So don't use SSL. You should be using TLS 1.2, right? Oh, wow, that's actually there. Certificate issues, right? Mismatched names, some of them expired, unknown certificate authority, right? These are all vulnerabilities on the network. Every time you're with one of those websites, it's popping those up with unknown certificate authorities. The DNS ones, you guys already answered for me with zone transfers. Other common DNS vulnerabilities are like, there's their amplification, right? You use DNS open resolvers and amplification attacks. NAT IP exposure. So if your internal IPs are being exposed, right, through NAT, not too sure how that would be exposed, but I guess it has happened. Leaving open protocols, right? SSH leaving your open remote desktop, leaving open your VPN. I know I definitely, I've definitely accidentally left my remote desktop to my desktop PC open once when I came to work. Nothing bad happened, but you know, good. But there's definitely be a vulnerability on your network. Okay. What about vulnerabilities for VMs? Come on, what's the scariest one you could think of?
Some kind of leakage from the VM to your host.
Yeah, some kind of VM sandbox escape. That's terrifying, right? It's like you think you have complete control over this thing and it reaches out. There was most recent Darknet Diaries episode I was listening to this weekend, I think, where the Pwn to Own. I think it was that one. Anyone listen to this one? Yes, Clara's nodding her head. She knows what I'm talking about. They were talking about selling a 0 day of an exploit that got command execution on the host machine from clicking a website on the guest, right? Just clicking a link on the website. Pretty cool. I guess from the demo that I heard, I didn't get to see it. It looks like, right, they have the VM set up, and they just click in their browser, and then all of a sudden a bunch of calculators open up on the host machine, the calc app. So cool stuff there. Definitely scary. Getting able to interface with the management of the VM system, of your virtualization, other types of things here. Go ahead.
Oh, is that like misconfigured config files or security?
What?
The management interfaces?
This would be if some kind of malware or something was able to interact with your virtualization management interface.
Gotcha.
So the software that makes the virtual hardware, something able to do that. Not being patched, right? You get new patches for VMware and for VirtualBox, right? So unpatched VMs. And then, right, just because it's virtual, you could have also virtual guests and virtual servers and virtual networks. It's like, it's what's the word? Fractal. It's recursive. It's rabbits all the way down if you want, right? For all of those same vulnerabilities that we had on the real machines, on the virtual machines, they're also there. And they're also something to be aware of. Okay. IoT and other, again, we did not talk too much about this in the Full Stack Red Team program, but these are things that you need to be aware of, right? So big things here is firmware generally never gets updated in IoT devices. I don't know when the last time you've updated your like Alexa or your smart light bulbs or any of those devices, smart refrigerator, whatever. Generally, they're not getting updated. So other things that happens, hard-coded passwords, right? You mentioned this before, but generally in tons of IoT devices, there are hard-coded passwords or there's no passwords and you can't really change them. Right? No one cares. Other vulnerabilities in IoT, think about the smart power grid, right? This is totally a attack surface now. Power plants have been attacked in the past. They're going to be attacked in the future. It is important that you, depending on if you're working in these types of systems like SCADA or industrial control systems, that you are aware that this is very common. Other things like microphones, cameras, right? Indicators of home presence, all of these things, all of these things can be hacked and have vulnerabilities within them, right? Just got my parents some smart bulbs. Don't know how I feel about it, but it's okay. So that brings us to vulnerability scanning, right? We've listed out all of the different vulnerabilities that we might be looking for. How do we actually go about finding them, right? So again, let's just so that we have the story in our heads. We've spent a whole bunch of time finding all of our assets and categorizing them and putting information of them and putting them into a beautiful system so that you can, take a look at them. And, we spent some time thinking about all the vulnerabilities that are out there. And now we have to now that we have all of our assets, let's scan them and look for what kind of vulnerabilities are already on the system. So the questions that you have when you're entering vulnerability scanning, firstly, is who's going to be scanning? Well, generally that's going to be you as the cybersecurity analyst, but it might not be, right? You might have other people on the IT team that do the scanning and then just kind of report into you. When is the scan going to be conducted? Again, timing is absolutely crucial, right? Do you need to can you do the scan during business hours or not? Does the system need to be taken down to be scanned? Right? These are questions that you need to answer. Again, which systems get scanned? Some systems, right? Depending on how you model your threats and how you manage your risk, maybe you just don't scan them because scanning them will just take way more time. You just, it's all about managing these things, right? There's no perfect solutions. You're always going to be making trade-offs. Again, how is scanning going to impact the system? Will scanning it slow things down? Will it take things down? Again, does the system need to be isolated? By this, I mean, do you need to take the system out of production and put it into some other environment before you can actually test it? Because if that's the case, then there's probably a bit of planning that needs to go into effect in order to do this, right? Like think about banks or other systems. I think probably think about maintenance on World of Warcraft or something like that. Like certain systems need to be isolated so things can be done on them. Random reference there, I guess, but that's what's on my mind. All right. So that's what scanning is. So let's talk about some of the scanners. You're going to use one today. You've used some in the past. Here are the big ones, right, that you should be at least a little bit familiar with. Nessus is the one you're going to be using today. It's fantastic. It's free, as long as you're using it not commercially. Nikto you've used before for looking through looking at websites. OpenVOS is another open and free one. WordPress Scan you've used before, right? For WordPress sites, these are all scanners that you should be somewhat familiar with the idea of. They produce vulnerability reports, right? Things to be aware of when you're scanning. Is this a credentialed scan or a non-credentialed scan? Are you scanning like someone that has credentials or that doesn't have credentials? Maybe you need to do both. When you get a scan, generally, you're going to be reported a CVSS number, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. They've changed. It used to be 1.0 to 2.0, and now it's at CVSS 3.0. We're going to talk a little bit about how to read them, but you end up with something that looks like a MAC address like that. We're going to go ahead and I'll take you right to the source to see how to piece this together. But at the end of the day, you're going to be given a number from 0 to 10. Higher is more dangerous, is bad, right? Lower is less dangerous. But there, we need to understand what actually goes into making these scores, because certain vulnerabilities might be more dangerous depending on the context, right? So let's take a look. Oh, cool. I have. We'll go to the actual site, to the actual CVSS database for this too. But this should look familiar to you, right? This exploit right here, shell shock. If you remember, that was the exploit used to get onto alpha. And so this is an output from Nessus. You're going to be using Nessus today. Again, the things I want to point out to you is it tells you right up top if it's even color coded how bad an exploit is. It describes it to you right there in just a few short sentences. It gives you some output as like how that actually happens. And it even gives you a couple of links for how to remediate and more information about this and all sorts of stuff like that. If you look towards the right, you will see the risk information. That's the to the right column, second bar down under risk information. That's where you see CVSS base score and CVSS temporal score. The temporal score is the score when it's taking into account to the context of this local environment. So, at a base level, this is a 10.0, which is like absolutely super critical. Shell shock is bad news, broke a lot of things in the world. But in this context, it's 8.7. Still pretty terrible, but not a 10. Okay. So let's take a look at CVSS 2.0. This is the 2.0 base metrics. I'll show you the 3.0 metrics too. There's not too much difference. I think they've just included more. They've given more context to the score. You see all these crazy numbers at the bottom. What do they actually mean? You don't have to memorize. I don't think you need to memorize them for the SIS exam. You might. Peter will be better at telling you. But where do these numbers come from? Actually, let me show you right from the source instead of from here. Let me grab the CVSS. There we go. Okay. So I'll send this link out to you. I'll put it in Slack right now, actually. So this is the National Vulnerability Database, right? From the great folks at NIST, right? That brought us our NIST 800-15. And this shows you how the equations for how these scores are calculated. Now, it's not super bananas. It's all of the normal things that we would put into account when we're trying to decide how bad a particular vulnerability is. So they rate them in terms of base, right? Like how bad it is in the base case. The actual in terms of impact, right? How bad is it if this actually happens, right? Do they just get root or do they just get, perhaps more privileges? Exploitability is generally how easy this is, to exploit. All right. If it's very easy and anybody can do it, much higher score. Here, there's some environmental factors that are considered as well. Right? Like, is this, are there other services on this machine? Is it connected to other things? All sorts of things like this. And you could take a look here, right? So here are the exploitability matrices, metrics. And so by that, do you need physical access for this attack vector? Can you be on the local network to do this? Can you be on an adjacent network to do this? Or do you have to be on any kind of network to do it, right? Is the attack complexity, right, is rated by low complexity or high complexity, right? Privilege is required to actually run this exploit, none, low, or high, right? All of this is what goes into account for that base score. All of these things are what goes into account for temporal. So as you can see, there is an absolute ton of context when we go into describing and defining vulnerabilities here. Do you need to memorize all of this? No, but what you do need to know is taking a look at this score, understanding that higher is worse. And I do believe they do ask you on the CISA exam of like, oh, this is rated a 9.3. What category of vulnerability is it? Is it critical? Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? That's for sure. They do ask about. But if they are asking about specifically these things, they're not going to ask you to like, here's a vulnerability, give me the number, right? They don't expect you to be able to calculate the number yourself. They just need you to be able to pull some context out of that number. So if I can wrap this whole thing up, what I'm saying is CVSS scores give you a broad, like a very base number, right? Between 0 and 10 to tell you how bad something is. And there's a whole bunch of factors that go into calculating that number. You can take a look at them here on that link that I had posted. Okay, you can even take a look at shell shock here because it's on there. Each CV has its own number. You could take a look at the more information regarding them. Cool. All right. So why do we manage our vulnerabilities? I feel like this is kind of almost a rhetorical question, right? We manage them so we don't get hacked, but there's more reasons than that. There's regulations, there's specific commitments that we have as a business to law that need to be followed, right? If we're handling medical records, if we're handling credit card information, personally identifiable information, right? There's going to be different regulations that go into how we have to deal with this data and how we manage it. And so if there's vulnerabilities, we have to be careful, right? So if you're handling credit cards, right? PCI, DSS is important, and FISMA is important, right? These are things that specify how you need to manage your data. There's business impacts, right? So beyond being told we have to do it, there's impact to the business if we don't manage our vulnerabilities, right? CIA gets impacted if vulnerabilities get affected by somebody, right? They can be limited, they can be serious, or they can be absolutely catastrophic, right? Like that's what I would put this SolarWinds hack almost is absolutely severe / catastrophic. Okay, there's security and privacy reasons, again, similar to CIA, but if you're doing anything in Europe, think about GDPR, right? There's going to be other regulation that you need to be aware of, as well as internal policies, right? Maybe your company just has a strong internal security policy. That's a good thing, right? So these are the why we do all of it. Almost rhetorical, but I think it's important that we understand. Okay, obviously external policies too. So the what of it. What are we doing? We're identifying the vulnerabilities on the assets that we have already identified. Okay, so this is the second step here. We're going to classify all of our different data as, data that needs to be more secure and protected or doesn't need to be more secure and protected, right? We have different methods of doing it. Like the government, public, secret, top secret, however you want to do it. It depends on your business or organization. But the data does need to be classified to help you decide on how bad a vulnerability might be. You have to pay attention to your business critical systems. And again, what are we worried about here? It's the same every time, CIA, right? Always the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of systems. Certain regulations and certain contracts will define how often we have to be scanning and patching our vulnerabilities. So sometimes it's not even up to us. We're just following a checklist sort of thing. Again, PCI systems and certain vendors will have these requirements that you do this. Okay. So finally, how? And again, here's my mantra, scan, patch, scan, right? That is going to be how you go about defending things. right? You have your list of assets. You've decided which ones are most important and that you need to keep up to date and most scanned and, be sure are as safe as can be. You scan them. You find what vulnerabilities are on them. You figure out how you can patch them, remediate them, and then you scan again once you do that, right? That's going to be the entire process. Again, you prioritize them. Your scanner is generally going to do a bit of prioritization for you, right? It'll tell you which ones are critical or not critical. But then again, it's up to you to determine if that is actually true, right? It's very possible that you do a scan and you find a whole bunch of machines, and it says one machine has a whole bunch, of incredibly critical vulnerabilities, and one doesn't, or has less so, I guess. And it's up to you to decide which one do you need to patch first. And right away you're thinking, well, if the one has more vulnerabilities that are more critical, let's do that one first. But it's up to you to know the context. What if that machine isn't on the network at all, or only stays internal? What if it can't be patched because it will break certain hardware that is attached to it, right? It's important that you understand these contexts. A great example of that, of like software that can't be patched, is sometimes software is attached to certain medical devices that just literally can't be patched, or you're going to break this giant device. Right? So how do we manage that? Maybe there's other ways that we can go about managing the vulnerability. So you're going to want documentation, right? You're going to see exceptions, right, to the rules all the time. There's going to be false positives. Again, that's why you scan, patch, scan. It's not scan and patch and you're done. And there's all sorts of processes that you're generally going to follow. Some kind of guidebook will be given to you for how to manage these things. Alternatively, you might have service level objectives or agreements that you have to follow, right? You might be working for an organization that just literally manages these devices for other organizations. In that case, you have to follow these SLOs or agreements. So, in summary, what are we talking about? Vulnerabilities obviously everywhere, right? We talked about them in hardware, we talked about them in networks, we talked about them in servers and applications, we talked about them in IoT devices, we talked them in virtual machines, right? Vulnerabilities, they're all over the place, and we have to be aware of them. We understand a little bit more about scanning and CVS, right? We know we're going to use some kind of software. We're going to, have our asset list. We're going to point our scanning software at it, and then we're going to take a look at the information that comes out of it. Generally, we're going to be looking at CVSS scores and using the context we know of our organization, deciding what to do with this information, right? Doing the actual vulnerability management part. What do we do? Okay. So let's talk about what we're going to do in class.